We are recording the interview of Derek Pridemore. This interview is being conducted by Keturah Edwards and David Berry from Wright State University Veterans Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University Veterans Military Center. It is 3:40 p.m. on September 19, 2017. First question is, where and when were you born?
I was born in January 11th, 1983 in Dayton, Ohio, at Good Sam Hospital.
Okay, and who were your parents and what did they do?
My father was Frank Pridemore. He was born in Virginia. He married my mother in Ohio, in Dayton. They worked at NCR together. They met there at work. My mother is named Cynthia Pridemore. We lived in Dayton near Siebenthaler until I was 7, and then we moved to West Milton, north of Dayton, in 1990. And we had a house there on J Street, and my dad drove trucks mostly, and Mom had a daycare business out of our home.
Okay. Do you have any siblings?
Yeah, I have an older brother named Landon. He's about a year and a half older than me, and he's married and lives in Inglewood. So.
And did he serve in the military?
No, he didn't.
Okay. What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was in high school. I joined right as I graduated when I was 18. So I was working at Walmart at the time in Troy.
Was that fun?
Working at Walmart
Mm-hmm.
as a teenager? I don't know. I got a hernia from pushing carts, so I had to have surgery right before I joined the military. Because I got a hernia pushing carts so much, so that sucked. But
did that cause any problems prior to
not
joining?
really. I mean, I had to have the surgery, but I recovered in enough time.
Okay.
You know.
And which branch of the military did you serve?
I was in the Navy.
Why did you pick the Navy?
My dad was in the Navy in Vietnam. That was part of it. And I wanted to travel. And part of the Navy that they kind of sell you on with the recruiters is that you'll travel a lot. So, sort of true. So, yeah, I did get to travel quite a bit, so that was nice. But that was the main reason, was travel, yeah.
Mm-hmm. What did your father do while he was in the Navy?
My dad was on a repair ship in Vietnam, a smaller ship, and he worked on one of the first shipboard computer systems. That was, the huge cabinet, gigantic computers. So he did that on that ship. He hasn't really gone into detail other than some stories about, ship life. But that was in the Southeast Asia. And he just mostly did repair stuff. So.
Okay. What happened when you departed for boot camp?
So the boot camp trip, that is a very brief memory. I remember when I got there, we went from Dayton to Chicago, and then we got on a bus for boot camp at Great Lakes. Did you go to Great Lakes as well? Yeah, okay. I don't know if it was the same place anymore. But I remember getting off the bus, and they don't really start yelling. They start yelling at you as soon as you get on the bus from the airport, and they start treating you, like you're in the military at that point. And then we got off the bus, and we had to give urine samples. That was one of the first things we had to do, and I could not go for like an hour and a half. So I had to stand there. This is pretty humiliating, but I had to stand there with my pants around my ankles and try to go for like an hour and a half. And I watched people come in, and they would go, and it was like I watched people cycle through. as I was sitting there waiting. And it wasn't that I was scared because they were yelling at me, it's because I didn't have enough water. So I was trying to drink the water fountain water and go. So that was a distinct memory that I have of that. But I remember going into the ship. They called the barracks the ship, and they started yelling at you right away. But I don't remember being very scared because they tell you to prepare for it. They tell you to get ready for that. So I was. So yeah.
You have any other memories while in boot camp?
Yeah. We had 3 train instructors, I guess you call it. Mm-hmm. 2 of them were relatively okay, and then the third was very, very mean. And he was meaner when the other ones weren't around. And he PT'd us harder, made us work out, exercise harder. One time they have a whole system of like who has control of the division, which is like 80 or 90 of us. And so after lunch you line up, I'm sure you know this, and then another one will come and take us and march us to where we need to go next. So one of us, dropped us off at chow, and then we lined up outside, and the next, the meaner guy didn't show up. And we thought this was like some kind of test, like we were standing there for 20 minutes and, it was hot. This was in August of 2001. So right before 9/11. So we were standing outside and it was hot, and we were, you had to stand at attention, so you're emotionless standing at attention, and we were there for 20 minutes, and we were drinking our water, taking breaks. So then 20 minutes turned into 40 minutes, and then 40 minutes turned into an hour, and the guy never came. Eventually, a division was passing by, and our leader, the recruit leader, I guess you would call it, he stopped the division commander, and which was, that was a thing at the time. You don't really approach other division commanders and tell them to stop. I need you. It doesn't really happen then. But he stopped him and said that, our division commander isn't here. He was supposed to be here a long time ago, and that you could see the concern on his face, like, what's going on? Where is this guy at? So, we eventually, like 20 minutes later, he came. I don't know what the excuse was, but he was supposed to be there and wasn't. And when we got back to the ship, he was angry at us for getting him in trouble for telling another division commander, because that, it's a small place, word travels. So after he apologized in front of the other instructors, he was alone with us again afterwards, and he PT'd us after standing outside in the heat, and we ran out of water, so he PT'd us again in the ship because we told on him. So that was a memory. I guess another memory is just being punished as a group for one person messing up was something that happened a lot. Like if they said don't talk, and then someone would be caught talking, multiple times right after they said don't talk, and then everyone would be punished for it, you push-ups, sit-ups, and that kind of thing. So that happened quite often. You can never really get people to cohesively just shut up or behave. So yeah. But yeah, that's about it for boot camp, really, that I can remember.
So what was your job title in the Navy? So
I did weather. I was an aerographer's mate, which is a really small rate field job, whatever you want to call it. I did well on the ASVAB for it, I guess. The recruiter said this is what you should do. I was like, okay. I didn't want to be an engineman or a bosun mate. I didn't want to do what a lot of other people were doing, like the harder labor. So I said, sure, I'll do weather. So we went to Biloxi, Mississippi for training. It was difficult. I almost failed. I barely passed the weather training, that part of it, but I did pass. And then, well, I guess what's the next question, I guess, because my job was weather.
So how did you adapt to military life?
I adapted pretty well, I guess. the regulations were not extremely hard to follow, you know, keep uniform neat and, you know, I just did what I was told, you know what I mean? I did what I was told. It wasn't hard for me. My life was not, I wasn't spoiled, you know, we weren't very wealthy. I knew what hard work was like. So that came easily to me, so, yeah.
So, your first duty station, where was it?
So my first duty station was Bahrain,
Mm-hmm.
NSA Bahrain, a little base at the time in 2001, 2002. And this was after so boot camp, I graduated 2 days after 9/11. And I do remember that because you practice marching and parading and all that stuff, and then you do it for this big presentation in the hall where all the families are supposed to be there. But since 9/11 had just happened, the hall was empty. It was just us parading for really nobody. And so then after, you know, the war had started, and I remember things got really serious really fast. I don't really know what it was like before out in the, you know, out in non-boot camp, but I remember that it just got heightened. Things got more serious as far as like responsibility. Like if you messed up, you know, you were called out on it more than before the war had started. It was really weird. So I went to Bahrain, and Operation Enduring Freedom, I believe, started, which was a war in in Afghanistan. So when I got to Bahrain, we were in charge of the weather for the entire operating area, which included Afghanistan. And all the weather in that area was our responsibility. So it was a desert island. I remember, oh man, I remember it being very hot. But you got used to the temperature quickly, I guess, because it's very dry temperature. And after about 110, it doesn't really feel much different. It just feels like 110 the whole time. So I had to live off base in an apartment because they didn't have barracks at the time. So that was, there wasn't much there in the surrounding area. There was just hotels and apartment buildings. There wasn't, the city was, you know, I didn't have a car, I had a bike, I just biked to the base and back. I didn't really go to the city. I did shopping at a shopping market like close to where I lived. I do remember the locals being very nice to me, and I don't really know whether it was because of the location of the base or whether they enjoyed having the money that we spent, but I remember them going out of their way to help me more than once. They never really gave me second looks. They never really treated me differently. Some of my neighbors in the apartment building were very, you know, they welcomed me into their home and taught me their customs and their traditions and stuff like that. A lot of the people that I worked with and on base told me that didn't happen with them. Most of them declined to do that. So I thought that was interesting. I got to know some of the local people that, and a lot of my friends on base that I worked with in the military, they thought that was strange. So most of them kind of kept a distance from the local people. So yeah, the work was, you know, 12 hours a day. We did weather reports for the base, and we also did weather reports for the pilots who were flying out and going to bomb the places in Afghanistan. So that's what I mostly did. I did weather reports and then updated stuff for the forecasters. I assisted the forecasters, if that makes sense. I collected all the data for them so they could make their forecasts and help the pilots.
So how was the food in your social life?
Food and social life, I mean, I made friends with the people I worked with. Food was okay. I liked the local food more than the base food, of course. Some of the restaurants in my area were really good, so I like that you could have delivery anytime you wanted from anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like certain places here that deliver. There, it's like a motorcycle will deliver you food. Yeah, I don't really remember much of a social life. I was 19 and I was very overwhelmed with work. I was very stressed out about that. My family was requesting money from me at the time because they thought I was making a lot, because they thought I was in a combat area and I was getting combat money. So I was sending a lot of money home, and I was relatively poor. So I do remember that.
So did you witness any casualties or destructions while in Bahrain?
No. No, it was a safe place, relatively. I did do auxiliary security force volunteer service, I guess. They asked me to do it. They said, you should probably do this, like, forcefully. So I did learn how to, I did have more weapons training than normal people did. I didn't have to stand guard shifts at the gates. I never saw anything. They told us that there were terrorists in the buildings across the way in the high-risers, and they were watching us, but I never saw anything. People approached the gates and they showed ID and I let them in, and nothing ever happened. I never discharged my weapon. I never had a reason to. I was never really scared there. So yeah, there is a difference between someone who was boots on the ground, probably you, compared to me, who, I was pretty close for being in the Navy. I was pretty close to where the action was for being in the Navy, but it wasn't in danger. I didn't think I was anyway. So there is a separation there, for sure.
So did you have to do your weather, do both of them at the same time?
Weather and security?
Mm-hmm.
The security thing was like an extra thing. But if I had that, it took a day off work, and I did that all day instead. So
Okay.
That lasted about 4 months, and then I just stopped doing it. So I put my time in, and that got me a nice thing on my, my record.
So after Bahrain, did you go somewhere else?
Yep, I spent a year in Bahrain. So February, March 2002. I went back home, and then I went to Norfolk to get on my ship, which was the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which is an aircraft carrier, CVN-71. The ship was not there at the time. They were in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
This was when Bush was trying to get us. He was selling the nation on getting into the war against Iraq. And right as I got to Norfolk, it had started. Operation Iraqi Freedom had started. So I got to Norfolk and I was waiting on my plane to go to my ship. And I remember watching on TV the protesters in New York and other cities protesting the war, and it was a massive protest, and I think about it now, how big it was. I didn't think about it then, but I remember at the time not understanding why they were protesting, because it had been sold to me as a military member. It had been sold to me quite clearly that this was, a good reason to go to war. There was lots of propaganda in the intermilitary. They tried to sell it to their own soldiers and sailors pretty well. So, I bought it at the time, but, so I flew out to my ship in the Eastern Mediterranean. I landed in Crete, a little island, and then I got on a transport plane that could land on a carrier that carried mail and stuff like that, dual prop. And I remember landing on the aircraft carrier taking, because you have to have a hard left, and then you have to land on the carrier. And I remember throwing up. I never throw up in planes. I never throw up on boats. I'm not motion sick, but I remember like the very hard left they take before they land. It just makes your stomach go into your mouth, and then you just. So I had the bag, and I puked in the bag. But I remember, landing very hard on the ship, catching the wire and everything, and the back opened up, and so I walked out on the deck, which was active, and another plane was coming behind us, an F-18, so I had to hurry. And I remember I walked into the hangar deck and meeting the people I was going to work with for the next 3 years. And so then ship life began. And we were in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we were actively bombed. This is the shock and awe thing that was happening. They were actively bombing Iraq. So I was, like the shit was going on right as I got there, and I had to jump into it. So went up to the office, and the carrier has a large, flight deck. Most of what happens on the ship occurs underneath that. Everyone lives under there. Everyone works under there. Everyone eats under there. Everyone sleeps under there. There's a building on top called the island. That's where the flight deck, the operators are, the captain, the navigators, and that's where the weather office is. So I was lucky enough to be part of the small group that worked in the island, and I had a window in the office. Most people didn't have that, so I was very lucky in that regard. That was my first interaction, really. It wasn't my first interaction with officers, but it was my first interaction with officers that was negative. The officers in Bahrain were more helpful to the enlisted. They were more understanding. I don't know, they weren't as strict, I guess. And they weren't as, what's the word I'm looking for, entitled? Mm. Yeah, they thought that the officers on the ships literally believed that they were better than enlisted, and they acted like it. And they rarely talked to you if you were enlisted. And whereas in Bahrain, it was like you worked together, you talked together, you sat together, you worked. I worked with the forecasters, which were officers most of the time. On the ship, the forecasters in a very small room sat on the other side of the room. They didn't really talk to us. We had about 7 enlisted, and there was like 4 or 5 officers, and then the chief petty officers and everything. For the first 3 months I was on the ship, I had to, this is mandatory for everybody, I had to do service work. I had to either work in the mess hall or do, I don't know what you call it, cleaning officers' quarters, like being a hotel maid. I had to make their beds, I had to clean their rooms, I had to, vacuum, because they had actual rooms and we had bunks. We had berthings of 40 plus people shoved into little tiny coffins. So my first experience with kind of being a servant, which I know sounds very harsh, but that's what it was. For 12 hours, I swept and cleaned after officers. So that kind of strained that relationship with them. And I'm sure in different branches it would have been much different. Mm-hmm. In the Army or the Marines, you become a cohesive unit with your officer because they have to take care of you and they have to make sure that you're okay. But in the Navy, on the ship, I didn't see them because I was working somewhere else on the ship. I was doing other things, so I didn't really have a relationship with them, and that led to constraints further on. So I'm trying to talk fast, sorry, because I don't have much time, but go ahead.
Okay, so how was duties while on the ship? Well, doing the weather, when you were doing the weather.
Yeah. So I did the same thing I did in Bahrain, except more. I did observing. I went out onto the islands, the balconies, I guess you'd call it. I don't know. I did weather observation up there. The weather on a ship is much different than a base because the ship is moving and it's a smaller area, sort of. and the weather changes very, very rapidly. So every 45 minutes we went up and looked, and someone would take a turn, and then you have to write out a very, very detailed observation that took maybe 10, 15 minutes on a very long sheet like this. And then you had to look at radar, you had to look at the winds, you had to do all kinds of stuff. You had to give information to the forecaster all the time. And then we would update the weather on the CCTV. That scrolled every few minutes or so. We had a balloon room on the aft of the ship that we would do balloons and let them off to get upper air stuff. But so this was during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and we were actively launching F-18s and bombers and stuff. And I would see the bombs go on the F-18s and as they took off, and I would see the bombs gone as they landed. And within this small ship community, they are very, what's the word for it? It was a very patriotic time. So there was a lot of, we're fighting the enemy kind of thing happening. And one of my most distinct memories is watching the CCTV in the office, and they would play, like this is after the first few weeks when we were making progress in Iraq, and they showed the black and white footage of a bomb going into a building. Mm-hmm. You've probably seen that. Like it has the crosshair on it, and it has like the bomb getting closer and closer to the building, and then it blows up. So there was a lot of that. There was like a montage being played on the CCTV of the ship to Metallica. I think it was like Kill 'Em All or something like that. So it was very, and I remember standing in the back of the office with my enlisted guys and my officers, and everyone was like, they weren't cheering, but they were like smiling, and they were like, this is really great. And I remember not understanding what was happening, or not necessarily disagreeing with what was happening, but I didn't feel good about what was happening. Because even though at the time I understood we were fighting the enemy and destroying or killing the enemy, I didn't feel good that I was part of it. So I didn't know. I was very confused at the time, and I started to get that kind of started my shift toward not really agreeing with most of the people I worked with. And what really ramped that up was for us to work in weather, we had to have secret clearance. So we had to know where the ship was going. We had to know where the planes were striking. We had to know that stuff, and to know that, you have to have secret clearance. And while it's not top secret, it's above confidential. So you had access. I had access. I was a petty officer at this point. I had just been promoted to E4, which is petty officer 3rd class. So I had increased responsibilities. You had access to stuff in the computer system, namely after-action reports of the pilots, because the pilots would say in the after-action reports, this is what the weather was like while we were flying, and you needed that. You need to have that information because it was relevant to the forecasters and the observers. And along with those reports were casualty reports. Observers would fly over and see what the damage was. They would see, they would get casualty numbers of friendlies and enemies. So a lot of the numbers I was seeing, it would be combatants and non-combatants, and the numbers next to the word non-combatants were large. So it was hard to read that and not. It's hard to read non-combatant casualties and not be affected by that, and knowing that I was in some way responsible for that. And this is something that it's not the same as being boots in the ground and shooting at people. I understand that, and I will never understand what that's like. I will never understand what being in the distress of battle is like. and being shot at. I will never understand that. I will never understand how you don't know if it's an enemy or not, but you know that they're shooting at you, so you shoot back. I will never understand that. But the clarity of seeing the numbers on a piece of paper or a computer screen, that I knew that people that were not involved, or maybe, you know, not necessarily innocent, but, you know, non-combatants, that word really sticks with me, because they were being killed and they didn't deserve it. You know, they were just there. So maybe if I was, you know, an engineman, or I was working in the mess hall, I wouldn't see stuff like that. But because I was seeing that, it changed my perspective on what I was doing. And that's something that I've been thinking about ever since. And I'm still trying to come to terms with it. And like I said, again, I can never compare that to being boots on the ground combatant, but it's a different type of effect on people who were not combatants. You know, being on a ship, being safe, you know, I wasn't afraid of being attacked on the ship. That wasn't what I was afraid of. So that's something that causes stress that isn't because of combat. It's just another thing that you see. So yeah.
So how have you come to terms with that?
I've talked to people about it, talked to friends, had conversations with them. Mostly they say that, you know, it's not your fault, you were just doing your job. And that provided some comfort, but I guess most of the comfort comes from I didn't know what I was doing, or what I was wrapped up in. And I was being sold things and told things to kind of make it okay at the time. There was a lot of, you know, it's sad that this is happening, but it has to happen. So then at the time I was like, okay, well, it has to happen. You know, these people are enemies. We have to do this. But afterwards, when I found out that we really didn't have to, that is what kind of builds on it. So, I don't know, I still think about it, but it's not as bad as it used to be. And it'll never be something like PTSD. It'll just be something I think about all the time, because, you know, the people that were being killed, even the people that were being killed that were enemies, these were Iraqis. They didn't have a lot of technology. We crushed them, essentially. So you have sympathy for the enemy, even, which is something that you don't want to talk about a lot. So, and I'm sure that people in the Army and Marine Corps have the same thing happen to them afterwards. They have sympathy for the enemy that they're fighting, and there's honor, you know, there's feelings of honor toward the enemy that you're fighting, you know, but I'll never understand that. So yeah.
Okay. What kind of friendships did you form while serving, and with whom?
Friendship was pretty tight with the enlisted. Like I said, there was a separation between the officers and the enlisted. Yeah, because you're living in a berthing with 40 dudes, you get pretty close to them over time, and you form close bonds with the enlisted guys, all the other E4s and E3s, and one guy I knew I served with on the ship. He was from Southern Ohio, so, you know, we bonded over that, and we drove, when we were back in Norfolk, we drove to Ohio, and I saw his family, and he saw my family in West Milton, so that was nice. But there's a lot of joking around, you know, a lot of jokes, a lot of hanging out at other people's places when you're in port. So that was fun. But I don't really talk to many of them now. I don't know if that's common with veterans. It's probably less common with, the Army and Marine Corps probably bond more than Navy, I think. Because when you're in the Navy and you're in port, you live at your home. And, you know, you go away from the ship to go live with your family and your kids. Whereas in the Army or the Marine Corps, I feel like that happens less because you're serving as a unit together and you have to stay together all the time. So I don't know. I'm curious to know how that was different, you know, within the branches. But yeah.
Next question is, how did you stay in touch with family and friends while on the ship?
Email mostly. Email was a big thing. Phone calls were not as regular. Letters were a thing back then. There was no video chat or anything like that, so I got letters from my grandma and my mom and some friends, and but it was mostly email, yeah. And even that took a lot of work, a lot of the time. But when I was home in Norfolk, I had an apartment in Virginia Beach. So after the OEF, the major attack, we were there for months and months, but we sailed back to Norfolk. And we were there, after we got to Norfolk, we had a 10-month dry dock period, which probably kept me sane because going out to sea sucked. And being at sea is 7 days a week, you know, 13, 14 hours a day. Like, there's no days off. You work all the time. It becomes like I mean, you feel like a machine after a couple months. You don't have any feeling of time. It just kind of rolls one day into the next. So being at sea is very boring. And you work 13 hours and then you do laundry if you can, and then you sleep. You don't really do much else. There's very little time. There's TV where you watch like half of a movie and then you go to sleep. So being back in Norfolk and having an apartment and having a life outside of the ship was very, very relieving to have that, and a luxury for sure. It makes me think of the Air Force, who mostly had places in the U.S. and then nice places in Europe where they would go to work on the base and then they would go home after the day was over. So that was nice. I had an apartment in Virginia Beach, about a mile from the beach, and yeah, it was nice to have a place away from the ship and away from Norfolk, for sure. So, yeah.
So after being on the USS Theodore, were you assigned somewhere else?
No, I stayed on the Roosevelt for I was in 4 years, and so 2001 to 2005, and after the dry dock period, I had about 6-7 months left, and we did sea trials and we did refit. We were in the docks for over a year, which I'm not religious, but thank God. Because going to sea, like I said, really sucked. So we went out to sea for just weeks at a time, which wasn't as bad, to do sea trials, to do training, to train the pilots. We would go out hundreds of miles from Norfolk, and then the trainer planes for the pilots in training. They would do that for hours and hours and hours. They would learn how to land on a carrier and how to take off, and they would, that's what they did. So we had to do that. So I stayed on the Roosevelt for the last 3 years, and So I got discharged from there. Yeah.
So how was your return home?
I came home and I put everything into a U-Haul van that was in my apartment, and I drove back to Ohio and put everything in storage, and I lived with my grandma for a few months. I got a job at a food packaging place, and tried to find stuff to do. Tried to find a good job, but I couldn't really find one. I worked at ConAgra near Tip City, which is they make like frozen pizza and stuff like that. spent most of my money that I had saved up. And then 2006, 2007, 2006 I got an apartment with a friend of mine, a school friend of mine, in Troy. And I lived there with him until 2008. In 2008, I saved money and I was working at Walmart again, and I used the money that I'd saved to open a comic book store in 2008 in New Lebanon, Ohio. So this was around the time of the Great Recession. So shortly after I opened my comic book store, I was doing well for about a year, and then the recession kind of made things tough, and my customers started to not be able to buy comics, so they just stopped coming in. I lost a lot of money, and then I had to close the store after about 2 years. So after I closed the store, I worked at Walmart again, in Inglewood this time, and this is probably the worst period of my life because I was very poor, and I was in debt, and I was working at Walmart, and it sucked really bad, and I didn't know what to do. So in 2011, I found out that I still had GI Bill access. I still had it available. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't really do well in high school, other than like as far as grades, except for history and stuff like that, because I was distracted by home life. So I didn't think I was going to do well in college. I didn't think that I would be good for it. I didn't think I was going to be a good student. But in 2011, I started at Wright State. I used my GA Bill, and I instantly loved every minute of university life. I loved my classes. I got interested in history. I started to pursue that as a major, and then I graduated in 2016 with my history degree. And then I moved on to the public history program, which is what I'm doing right now. And so I'm learning how to work in a museum, learning how to work in an archives or a park, and kind of interpret and work with objects, make exhibits, stuff like that. And I really enjoy it. And I'm interning at a museum right now, the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center in Wilberforce, and I love it. And it's what I want to do after I graduate. I want to work in a museum and do that kind of work because I feel like it's more important to bring history to the public. And I've used what I learned in the military as far as leadership and teamwork. And one of the very few things that I got out of the positive things I got out of the military, other than free college, was not being afraid to kind of take the reins and lead, because you're forced to in the military. And even though you don't want to, you have to do it. So I found that's very helpful in museum work because you have a lot to do and you don't have much time to do it. So you need people to kind of give direction. Yeah, I just kind of gave my whole life story there, but I wanted to get it out there, I guess. So, go ahead.
Are you a member of any veterans organizations?
No. One of the things that I've failed to really do is get involved with veterans afterwards. I feel like I don't really, I feel like I don't fit the mold of a normal veteran, if that makes any sense. I don't, because of my experiences, because of education and especially in history, I've come to not be I've come to be against things like nationalism. I've come to be against things like patriotism. I've come to be against things like, I understand why we have a military, and I understand why we need the military, but at the same time, I'm very much, sometimes I just think that it needs to go away. That the military is, and I try to say this very strongly, that the people in the military are not the problem. It's the people who are in control at the top. The people in the military, my guys that I was enlisted with, even the officers, I'll give them a pass. Even them, you know, they were just doing their jobs, and they were doing what they thought was right. I haven't gotten involved with veteran stuff as much as I should be doing. I've found kind of new avenues to do stuff. I want to work with minority veterans. I want to work with African American veterans, and I want to kind of get them the recognition that they deserve. And part of working at the museum, the African American Museum, I'm finding all these stories about minority veterans who have given so much, and they are rewarded with relatively little compared to white veterans. So that's something that I want to focus on as I go forward with my life, is to get involved with veterans more, but get involved with the minority veterans and homeless veterans. I want to start finding out how to help them, and I've recently got in contact with the American Legion, who has a homeless veterans program, and they don't have one in Dayton. So I talked with them about setting one up in Dayton to get homeless veterans in need. Some of them don't know that you can go to the VA and get health care. Some of them don't know that. Some of them don't know that there are benefits out there for them. A lot of minority veterans don't know that. They come to Wright State and they get told all this stuff, but a lot of people don't know that they have access to these benefits, and I would like to help them if I can. So that answers that question.
What are some life lessons you learned while in the military service?
Life lessons?
Yes.
Holy crap. Dear God. I learned so much being in the military that translates well to civilian life. And I feel like I learned, I know they say this a million times, but you learn discipline. You learn to get things done because they need to be done. You learn to work with others even if you don't like them. So you learn that kind of thing. You learn to respect other people. You learn, especially with traveling, and that's one of the biggest things. You learn to respect the people who live in the country that you're visiting. You learn to respect, and one thing that I don't think a lot of military people get credit for is, at home there's a lot of anti-Muslim or anti-whatever, but when you're in the base, they put you through a training program, you know, to say, you're living in these people's countries. You have to respect where you are, and you have to respect the people that you live around. And that, I think that needs to get more publicity. Like in Bahrain, especially, like we were taught, forcefully taught, to not disrespect the people that you're living with. We are guests in their country, and a lot of training goes toward that, to make sure that you know that you have to respect other people. So that I learned that. I mean, I would have learned somewhere else, but I feel like I learned a lot of it there, just by traveling and going to other countries. You learn to respect other people. So, yeah.
Okay, I only got a couple of questions left. How has your military service impacted your feelings about war in general?
I think I already touched on that, but I very much am against war now, and I don't know if that's a common thing or not. I'm very much against war, and I don't think that there's an easy solution to that. I feel like I do see things happening in the world, and I'm like, well, this could have gone a different way if we didn't act so aggressively. And I you know, when you're in another country and you come up to a local and you say, you know, hey, what about your government, you know, and then they say to you, hey, you know, what about your government? And you find common ground with people, and it makes you really think, you know, maybe this isn't such a good idea, if that makes sense. Maybe we should try a different way to do this. And I feel like the expenditure of money, it's $1 million a day to run an aircraft carrier. So, and LHD is probably, 500,000. So we have what, like 13, 14 aircraft carriers, and the next country has like 2, maybe 1 or 2. So I feel like there has to be a certain amount of military spending, I feel like we are 80 million times above what we need to be spending on, and then we can't spend money on things like welfare, and then you have the whole trans people in the military, the total cost for them, something like 2 million. People were arguing about 8 or 9, 10 million, and I'm like, the only thing I was thinking of was it's $1 million a day to run a carrier, and you're arguing about $8 to $10 million. Like, that really got to me. So, I don't know. I think that it's ridiculous. War is ridiculous, and we need to stop doing it. So, but we can stop there because I have the thing. So, what was your final question, I guess?
Oh, okay. What message would you like to leave for future generations who would view or hear this interview?
I guess I would say, think about what you did in the military, and think about how you can use that to help people now. Think about what you can do to help people around you. Think about in your local community. Think about what you can do to help veterans who are not in the same level of aid that you have. If you're in a good position as a veteran, there are veterans that are not. They need help. It might just be something as simple as, hey, did you know that you have these benefits? That's really simple. And a lot of them, they need that. So I think that, and also reflecting on what you did while you were there, and not getting feeling too much guilt about it. Because it really isn't the line members. It's not the soldiers, it's not the sailors, it's the people at the top that are the evil ones. So that's what I'll say.
Okay.
So.
That concludes our interview. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.